The howling wind slapped against Catherine Everett's face like 1,000 icy needles as she stumbled through knee-deep snow, the bitter reality of her husband's betrayal as cold as the blizzard enveloping her. It was 1878 in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, and at 26 years old, Catherine had never imagined she would die alone in a snowstorm, miles from Bodie, abandoned by the man who had vowed to love and protect her until death parted them. Catherine's fingers had long since gone numb, her thin woolen gloves offering little protection against the biting cold. The leather of her boots was soaked through, each step a painful reminder of her desperate situation. 6 hours earlier, her husband James had driven their wagon into a ditch during the unexpected early winter storm. After a heated argument about whose fault it was, he had taken their only horse, promising to ride ahead to Bodie and return with help. "Stay with the wagon, Kathy," he had said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'll be back before nightfall." As the sun began to set beyond the curtain of swirling snow, Catherine had realized the terrible truth: James wasn't coming back. Perhaps he had never intended to. Their marriage had been deteriorating for months, his gambling debts and drinking growing worse with each passing week. The promise of gold in Bodie had been their last hope, a desperate attempt to start over. Now, Catherine fought against the wind, having abandoned the wagon when the temperature dropped dangerously low. She had taken what supplies she could carry: a small satchel containing a blanket, the last of their jerky, and a nearly empty canteen. Her wedding band was still on her finger, though she had contemplated throwing it into the snow more than once during her desperate trek. "God help me," she whispered through cracked lips, her words immediately swallowed by the roaring wind. The world around her was turning white, the boundaries between earth and sky blurring into a disorienting void. Catherine stumbled, falling hard onto her hands and knees. The snow soaked through her skirts, the cold seeping into her bones. For a moment, she considered simply staying there, letting the snow cover her like a blanket until sleep took her. A sob escaped her throat as she pushed herself back up. Her parents had not raised her to give up, no matter how dire the circumstances. She had survived the loss of her family farm during the drought of '73, the death of her parents to fever the following year. And she would survive this too, even if her heart was breaking. As Catherine trudged forward, the storm intensified, blinding her with walls of white. She had no idea if she was even heading in the right direction anymore. Bodie could be miles in any direction. Her thoughts drifted to the stories she'd heard about the mining town, how it had sprung up almost overnight following a profitable gold discovery. How it was growing wilder by the day, with saloons and brothels outnumbering churches 20-1. "Just keep moving," she told herself, even as her legs threatened to buckle. One foot in front of the other. She wasn't sure how much time had passed when she spotted a faint, flickering light in the distance. At first, Catherine thought it might be a hallucination, her mind playing cruel tricks as hypothermia set in. But as she staggered closer, the light remained steady, a beacon of hope in the swirling white nightmare. It was a cabin, small but sturdy, with smoke curling from a stone chimney. Catherine's heart leapt with desperate hope as she summoned her remaining strength to reach the door. Her numb fingers could barely form a fist as she pounded against the rough-hewn wood. "Help," she tried to call, but her voice came out as little more than a rasp. She struck the door again, harder this time, praying someone would hear before her strength gave out entirely. The door swung open suddenly, and Catherine nearly fell forward into the arms of a tall man silhouetted against the warm glow of a fire. Strong hands caught her by the shoulders, steadying her. "Good Lord, woman," a deep voice exclaimed. "What in heaven's name are you doing out in this storm?" Catherine opened her mouth to reply, but exhaustion and cold overwhelmed her. Her vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges. The last thing she registered, before losing consciousness, was being lifted into strong arms and carried into blessed warmth, the door shutting firmly against the howling blizzard. When Catherine awoke, it was to the crackling sound of a fire and the feeling of warmth gradually returning to her limbs. She was lying on a narrow bed, covered with several thick furs and blankets. Her wet clothes had been removed, replaced with a large flannel shirt that smelled of pine and smoke. For a moment, disorientation gripped her. Where was she? Then the memories came flooding back. James, the wagon, the storm, the cabin. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. "Easy there," came that same deep voice from earlier. "You're safe, but you need to rest." Catherine turned her head to see a man sitting in a wooden chair near the fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. His hair was dark and slightly too long, curling at the collar of his worn blue shirt. But it was his eyes that caught her attention. They were a clear, striking blue, regarding her with concern. "Where am I?" Catherine managed, her throat painfully dry. The man stood and poured water from a pitcher into a tin cup, then approached the bed. "My cabin, about 15 miles east of Bodie." He helped her sit up slightly to drink. "I'm Kieran Tanner. Most folks call me Kit." Catherine took small sips of the cool water, relief washing through her as it soothed her parched throat. "Catherine Everett, thank you for taking me in." Kit nodded, his expression serious as he took the empty cup. "You were half frozen when you appeared at my door, any longer out in that storm and—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They both knew what would have happened. "My husband," Catherine said, the words catching in her throat. "He left to get help hours ago, our wagon." She trailed off, seeing something flicker across Kit's face, a hardening of his features that told her he understood more than she was saying. "No one's passed this way today," Kit said carefully, "and no one with any sense would ride into Bodie in this weather. The trail's treacherous even in fair conditions." He paused, studying her face. "Did he leave you alone at the wagon?" Catherine nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The confirmation of what she already knew, that James had abandoned her, was almost more than she could bear. Kit's jaw tightened, but his voice remained gentle. "Well, you're safe now. The storm's likely to last another day at least. You can stay here until it passes." "I don't want to impose," Catherine said automatically, years of propriety making her protest despite her desperate circumstances. A small smile touched Kit's lips. "Madam, there's nowhere else for you to go, and I'm not about to send you back into that blizzard. Besides," he added, glancing around the simple one-room cabin, "it gets mighty quiet out here. Some company might be welcome." As if to emphasize his words, the wind outside howled louder, rattling the shutters on the small windows. Catherine felt a shiver run through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "You're not alone anymore, Mrs. Everett," Kit said softly, meeting her eyes with a steady gaze. "Not as long as you're here." Something in his words, the simple kindness, the promise of safety, broke through the wall of shock and fear Catherine had built around herself during her ordeal. Tears welled in her eyes, and before she could stop them, they were streaming down her face. Years of holding everything together through hardship, through a failing marriage, through James's increasing cruelty, crumbled in an instant. Kit looked momentarily alarmed at her tears, but he recovered quickly, offering a clean handkerchief from his pocket. "I've got some stew on the fire," he said, giving her privacy by turning away. "Once you feel up to it, you should try to eat something, build your strength back up." Catherine wiped at her tears, embarrassed by her breakdown in front of a stranger. "Thank you, Mr. Tanner." "Kit," he corrected, stoking the fire. "Nobody calls me Mr. Tanner except the banker in Bodie, and that's only when he's trying to sell me something I don't need." A small, unexpected laugh escaped Catherine, surprising them both. Kit grinned over his shoulder, and for the first time since the blizzard began, Catherine felt a tiny flicker of hope warm her from within. "Can you tell me about yourself, Kit?" Catherine asked after she had eaten a bowl of surprisingly delicious rabbit stew. She was sitting up in bed now, propped against the wall with blankets wrapped around her shoulders. Her body ached from cold and exertion, but the hot food had helped immensely. Kit sat in his chair, whittling a small piece of wood with practiced strokes of his knife. Wood shavings curled at his feet as he worked. "Not much to tell," he replied. "I've been in these parts about 3 years now. I work my claim most days, trap in the winter, keep to myself mostly." "You're a miner?" Catherine asked, thinking of the thousands who had flocked to California chasing dreams of gold. Prospector, Kit corrected with a small smile. Miners work for wages in someone else's hole. I work my own claim. Found a decent vein last summer, nothing to make me rich, but enough to keep me in supplies and whiskey. Catherine nodded, her gaze drifting around the cabin. Despite its small size, it was neat and well organized. A rifle hung over the door, ammunition stacked neatly on a shelf beside it. Books, actual books, not just newspapers or almanacs, lined another small shelf. Tools hung from pegs on the wall, and dried herbs and meat hung from the rafters. It wasn't the home of someone who merely survived, it was the home of someone who had created a life for himself. And before that, she asked, genuinely curious about this solitary man who had saved her life. Kit's hands stilled momentarily on his carving. Was a cowhand for years, mostly in Texas. Rode with a cattle drive up to Montana, did some scouting for the Army after the war. His voice carried no particular emotion as he listed these facts, as if reading them from a ledger. Tried my hand at a few other things. Nothing stuck until I came here. Catherine sensed there was much more to his story than he was telling, but she didn't press. They were still strangers, after all, despite the unusual circumstances that had thrown them together. "And you, Mrs. Everett?" Kit asked, turning the conversation back to her. "What brings you to these mountains in the dead of winter?" Catherine's fingers twisted in the blanket. "James, my husband, heard about the gold strikes in Bodie. We were living in Sacramento, but things weren't going well there." She chose her words carefully, unwilling to share the full extent of their troubles with a stranger. "He thought we could make a fresh start." Kit nodded, his expression neutral, but Catherine could see he was reading between the lines of her careful explanation. "Bodie's no place for fresh starts," he said bluntly. "It's a rough town, getting rougher by the day. They say there's a killing every morning before breakfast." "That's an exaggeration, surely," Catherine said, though she had heard similar stories. "Not by much," Kit replied. "Gold brings out the worst in men, greed, violence." He paused. "Abandonment." Catherine flinched at the word, and Kit immediately looked regretful. "I apologize," he said. "That was indelicate." "It was honest," Catherine replied, looking down at her hands where her wedding band still gleamed dully in the firelight. "And accurate. James and I, things haven't been right between us for a long time." She surprised herself with the admission, but something about the isolation of the cabin, the intimacy of being rescued from certain death, made honesty feel like the only appropriate response. "Men who leave women alone in blizzards aren't worth the breath used to speak their names," Kit said, his voice hardening. Then, more gently, "You should rest. Tomorrow will be soon enough to figure out what comes next." Catherine nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she still was. As she settled back down under the blankets, she watched Kit return to his carving, his strong hands moving with surprising grace as he shaped the wood. "Thank you," she said again, her eyelids growing heavy. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here." Kit looked up from his work, his blue eyes solemn. "I know exactly what would have happened," he said quietly, "and I'm glad I was here to prevent it." As Catherine drifted off to sleep, she realized it was the first time in years that she felt truly safe. The blizzard raged for 3 more days, the wind howling around the cabin like a living thing seeking entry. Inside, Catherine and Kit fell into an unexpected but comfortable routine. Kit insisted she continue to take the bed while he slept on a bedroll near the fire. During the days, he taught her to play poker with a worn deck of cards, read aloud from one of his books a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets that surprised her, and told her stories of his travels across the Western Territories. Catherine, for her part, mended Kit's clothes with neat, practiced stitches and helped prepare meals from his stores of preserved foods. They were simple tasks, but they gave her a sense of purpose and helped keep the dark thoughts about James and her uncertain future at bay. On the morning of the 4th day, Catherine woke to silence. The constant howl of the wind had ceased, replaced by a stillness that seemed almost unnatural after days of endless noise. "Storms passed," Kit said, looking up from where he was pulling on his boots. "I need to check my traps and make sure the lean-to didn't collapse. Will you be all right here for a few hours?" Catherine nodded, pushing back the blankets. She was wearing a pair of Kit's trousers, rolled up several times at the cuffs, and one of his flannel shirts. Her own clothes had been washed and dried but were too impractical for the cold cabin. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "Be careful out there," Kit nodded, pulling on a heavy coat and gloves. He checked his rifle before slinging it over his shoulder. "There's coffee on the stove." "I won't be gone long." After he left, Catherine busied herself with straightening the cabin, trying not to think about what would happen now that the storm had passed. Would Kit expect her to leave immediately? Where would she go? The thought of Bodhi made her stomach clench with anxiety. She had no money, no connections there. James had probably already spread some tale about what had happened, painting himself as the wronged party, no doubt. Catherine was so lost in these worrying thoughts that she nearly jumped out of her skin when the door burst open. Kit stood there, his face grim, snow still clinging to his coat and hat. "What is it?" Catherine asked, alarm rising within her. "Are you hurt?" Kit shook his head, closing the door behind him. "I found a horse," he said, "frozen solid about 2 miles south. Bay gelding with a white blaze down its face." Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. That's our horse," she whispered. "Samson." James had been riding Samson when he left her. Kit removed his hat, snow falling from the brim to melt on the floor. "There was no sign of a rider," he said carefully. "But in this kind of storm, tracks would be covered quickly." Catherine sank onto a chair, her mind racing. Had James been thrown? Had he abandoned the horse as well? Or had something more sinister happened? "I need to go to Bodhi," she said suddenly, standing up. "James might be there, he might have made it on foot." Kit's expression was skeptical, but he didn't contradict her. "The trail will be dangerous after the snow. Drifts will be high, and there's always the risk of avalanche on the steeper sections." "I have to try," Catherine insisted. "If nothing else, I need to know what happened." Kit studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but not today. The light's already starting to fade, and we'd never make it before dark. We'll leave at first light tomorrow." Catherine noticed his use of "we," but didn't comment on it. The thought of making the journey alone was terrifying, but she hadn't wanted to presume on his kindness further. "Thank you," she said simply. Kit shrugged out of his coat. "Don't thank me yet. It'll be a hard ride, and Bodhi might not have the answers you're hoping for." Catherine nodded, knowing he was right, but needing to make the journey anyway. "I just need to know," she said softly. "One way or the other." That night, as they sat before the fire eating a dinner of beans and the last of the rabbit, Catherine found herself studying Kit's profile. In the few days she had known him, he had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. He was a man of few words but deep thoughts, she had discovered. His books revealed a mind hungry for knowledge despite his lack of formal education, and his skill with his hands, whether carving wood, setting traps, or even cooking, spoke of a practical intelligence honed by years of self-reliance. "You're staring," Kit said without looking up from his plate. Catherine flushed, embarrassed at being caught. "I was just thinking," she said, "about how strange life is. A week ago, I didn't know you existed. If things had gone differently, if James hadn't left me, if I hadn't found your cabin, we would never have met." Kit set his empty plate aside, considering her words. "My pa used to say that fate has a way of putting people where they need to be, even if they don't recognize it at the time." "Do you believe that?" Catherine asked. "I don't know," Kit admitted. "But I do know that finding you half frozen on my doorstep wasn't something I expected when I woke up that morning." His blue eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the unusual connection that had formed during their brief time together. "Whatever happens in Bodhi," Catherine said, suddenly needing him to know, "I'm grateful for these days here, for your kindness." Kit looked momentarily uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Anyone would have done the same," he said gruffly. "No," Catherine contradicted him gently. "They wouldn't have. Most men would have done the bare minimum to keep me alive, then sent me on my way as soon as possible. You've been." She searched for the right word. "Generous, with your home, your food, your time." Kit stood abruptly, gathering their plates. "We should turn in early," he said, clearly unwilling to accept her praise. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Catherine nodded, recognizing his desire to change the subject. As she prepared for bed, she wondered about the man who had saved her life, what experiences had shaped him, what hurts he carried that made him retreat from simple gratitude. There was a story there, she was certain, but whether she would ever hear it remained to be seen. Morning came with clear skies and brilliant sunlight that made the snow-covered landscape almost painfully bright. Kit had risen before dawn to prepare for their journey, packing supplies and readying his horse, a sturdy piebald gelding named Jasper. "He's strong enough to carry us both," Kit explained as he tightened the saddle girth. "It'll be slower but safer than trying to walk through these drifts." Catherine nodded, pulling on the coat Kit had lent her. It was far too big, but lined with sheep's wool and warmer than anything she had ever owned. Her own clothes were layered beneath it, the dress and petticoats still impractical, but necessary if she was to appear respectable upon reaching Bodie. The thought of the mining town filled her with dread. What awaited her there? Would James be there, ready with excuses and explanations? Or would she discover that he had truly abandoned her, leaving her to an uncertain future in a rough frontier town, having second thoughts? Kit asked, noticing her hesitation. Catherine squared her shoulders. "No." "I need answers." Kit nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then let's find them." The journey to Bodie was even more difficult than Kit had warned. The trail was barely visible beneath the deep snow, and several times they had to backtrack when drifts proved impassable. Kit sat behind Catherine in the saddle, his arms on either side of her as he handled the reins, his solid presence a reassurance against the treacherous conditions. They spoke little during the journey, but the silence between them was comfortable. Catherine found herself acutely aware of Kit's nearness, the warmth of his body against her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the occasional brush of his beard against her temple when he leaned forward to speak. "There," Kit said finally, as they crested a ridge around midday. "Bodie." Catherine followed his gaze to where the town sprawled across a barren hillside below them. Even from a distance, she could see the frantic activity of a boomtown in full swing, new buildings under construction, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys, the tall structures of mine headframes punctuating the skyline. "It's bigger than I expected," she said, anxiety tightening her chest. "It's grown fast," Kit agreed. "Too fast, if you ask me. People building without thinking, everyone after quick money." There was disapproval in his voice. "Town like this, the only ones who get rich are the saloon owners and the undertakers." Catherine shivered, not entirely from the cold. "Let's get this over with." As they rode into Bodie, Catherine was struck by the noise and chaos after days of quiet in Kit's cabin. The main street was a churned mess of mud, snow, and refuse. Men in varying states of sobriety stumbled between saloons despite the early hour. A group of Chinese workers hurried past, heads down, carrying heavy loads. Somewhere a piano played a jaunty tune, competing with shouts, laughter, and the constant metallic clang from the stamp mills crushing ore. Kit guided Jasper through the crowd with practiced ease, heading toward a weathered building with a sign declaring it the Miners' Rest Hotel and Boarding House. "We'll start here," he said, dismounting before helping Catherine down. "If your husband made it to town, someone will know." The hotel owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Fleming, listened to Catherine's story with thinly veiled skepticism. "Plenty of men come through here with tales of wives left behind," she said, eyeing Catherine's borrowed coat and Kit's protective stance beside her. "But I do recall a James Everett checking in 3 days ago, paid for a week up front." Catherine felt her knees weaken with a mixture of relief and anger. James was alive and had made no effort to send help back for her. "Is he here now?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady considering the turmoil inside her. Mrs. Fleming shook her head. "He usually heads to the Golden Eagle around this time, spends most days there from what I've seen." Kit's jaw tightened. "The saloon on the corner," Mrs. Fleming nodded. "That's the one." "You his wife for certain?" she asked Catherine doubtfully. "Yes," Catherine replied, removing her glove to display her wedding band. "For 7 years," Mrs. Fleming's expression softened slightly. "Well, I'd prepare yourself, Mrs. Everett." Your husband's been enjoying the company of the girls at the Eagle since he arrived, making quite a spectacle of himself with his spending, too. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. James had not only abandoned her to die in the blizzard, but had immediately sought comfort in a brothel upon reaching town. Kit's hand came to rest supportively on her lower back. "Thank you for the information," he told Mrs. Fleming. "Is there somewhere Mrs. Everett could freshen up before we continue our inquiries?" Mrs. Fleming gestured to a door off the lobby. "Washrooms through there. Take your time." In the small washroom, Catherine splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the spotted mirror. She hardly recognized the woman looking back at her pale from her ordeal, but with a determined set to her jaw that hadn't been there before. "I'm going to the Golden Eagle," she announced when she rejoined Kit in the lobby. "Catherine," Kit began, his use of her first name startling them both. "Are you sure that's wise? Places like that aren't meant for decent women." "I need to see him," Catherine insisted. "I need to look him in the eye when he explains why he left me to die." Kit studied her face, then nodded once. "All right, but you're not going alone." The Golden Eagle Saloon was exactly what Catherine had imagined and feared, a cavernous space filled with smoke, noise, and the smell of unwashed bodies and spilled whiskey. Heads turned as she entered with Kit close behind her, conversations momentarily halting at the unusual sight of a respectable-looking woman entering such an establishment. Catherine scanned the crowd, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. And then she saw him, James, seated at a card table near the back, a glass of whiskey at his elbow and a painted woman perched on his knee. He was laughing, his head thrown back, clearly having the time of his life. For a moment, Catherine couldn't move, the reality of his betrayal hitting her like a physical blow. Then anger surged through her, propelling her forward. "James," she said, her voice cutting through the noise as she approached the table. Her husband's head snapped up, his expression changing from confusion to shock to something like fear as he recognized her. "Catherine," he stammered, pushing the saloon girl off his lap as he stood. What are you doing here?" "I survived," she said simply, aware of the sudden interest from the other card players and nearby patrons. "No thanks to you." James's face flushed, his eyes darting around as if seeking escape. "Now, Kathy, it wasn't like that. I tried to get back to you, but the storm—" "Don't," Catherine cut him off, her voice steady despite the emotion churning within her. "Don't lie to me, not now." James's expression hardened. "You don't understand. I had to make a choice, and you chose to leave your wife to die," Kit interjected, stepping forward to stand beside Catherine. James's eyes narrowed as he took in Kit's protective stance. "Who the hell are you?" "The man who saved your wife's life," Kit replied evenly. "Since you couldn't be bothered." A dangerous flush spread across James's face. "You've got no right to interfere between a man and his wife, stranger." "He has every right," Catherine said firmly. "He showed me more kindness in 4 days than you have in years." The saloon had gone quiet, the drama unfolding before them more entertaining than any card game. James seemed to realize they had an audience and attempted to regain control of the situation. "Catherine, you're upset, I understand that," he said, lowering his voice. "But let's discuss this in private. There's no need to air our troubles in front of the whole town." Catherine looked at her husband, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time. The charming smile that had once won her heart now seemed calculating. The handsome features she had once adored now appeared weak and dissipated. This was a man who had left her to die, who had taken their money and spent it on whiskey and women while she fought for her life in the blizzard. "There's nothing to discuss," she said quietly. "You made your choice, James. Now I'm making mine." She pulled off her wedding ring and placed it on the card table with a small, final-sounding click. "I want a divorce." James's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful, careful," Kit warned, his hand moving to rest on the revolver at his hip. James glanced from Kit to Catherine, then around at the crowd of onlookers. Whatever he saw there made him reconsider his next words. "Fine," he spat. "You want to throw away 7 years of marriage for some mountain man, go ahead, but don't come crawling back when you realize what you've given up." Catherine almost laughed at the absurdity of his statement. What have I given up, James? A man who lies, gambles away our savings, and leaves me to die when things get difficult? She shook her head. I should have left years ago. She turned to go, her head held high despite the whispers and stares from the saloon patrons. Kit followed close behind, his solid presence a comfort as they pushed through the batwing doors into the cold afternoon air. Once outside, Catherine's composure cracked. She stumbled to the side of the building, leaning against the rough wooden wall as her breath came in shuddering gasps. "Catherine," Kit said gently, his hand hovering near her shoulder, unsure whether to touch her. "I'm all right," she managed, wiping at tears she hadn't realized were falling. I knew, but seeing him there so unconcerned." "You were brave in there," Kit said. "Braver than most." Catherine looked up at him, seeing concern and something else, admiration perhaps, in his blue eyes. "What do I do now?" she whispered. Kit's expression was solemn. "Whatever you want. That's the thing about endings, they're also beginnings, if you choose to see them that way." Catherine considered his words, feeling a strange sense of lightness despite the uncertainty of her situation. For the first time in years, she was free to make her own decisions, to chart her own course. "I don't want to stay in Bodie," she said decisively. Kit nodded. "Can't say I blame you. Town like this will eat a person alive." "Would it?" Catherine hesitated, then pressed on. "Would it be possible for me to return to your cabin, just until I figure out my next steps? I can cook and clean, help with chores. I wouldn't be a burden." Something flickered across Kit's face, surprise, followed quickly by something warmer. "It wouldn't be proper," he said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Catherine gave a small, tired laugh. "After what just happened in there, I think propriety is the least of my concerns." She gestured toward the saloon. "Besides, everyone in town will already assume the worst." Kit was quiet for a moment, considering. "My cabin's small," he said finally, "and life there is hard, especially in winter." "I'm stronger than I look," Catherine replied, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." A slow smile spread across Kit's face. "No, you're not, are you?" He seemed to come to a decision. "All right, you can stay until spring if that's what you want. By then, the passes will be clear and you can decide where you want to go next." Relief washed through Catherine. The thought of returning to the quiet sanctuary of Kit's cabin, away from the noise and chaos of Bodie, was immensely appealing. "Thank you," she said simply. Kit adjusted his hat. "Don't thank me yet. Winter's long in these mountains, and I'm not always the easiest company." Catherine thought of the peaceful days they had already shared, of Kit's quiet strength and unexpected kindnesses. "I think I'll manage," she said, offering him a small smile. As they made their way back to where Jasper was hitched, Catherine felt lighter than she had in years, despite the uncertainty ahead. She had ended one chapter of her life today. What the next would bring remained to be seen, but for the first time in a long while, she faced the future with something like hope. The journey back to Kit's cabin was easier in some ways than their trip to Bodie, the trail already broken, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. But in other ways, it was more difficult. Catherine was acutely aware of Kit behind her in the saddle, of the potential impropriety of what she had proposed, of the uncertain future stretching before her. "You're quiet," Kit observed as they followed a stream through a narrow valley, the water rushing beneath a thin crust of ice. "Just thinking," Catherine replied. "It's been an eventful day." Kit made a sound of agreement. "Having regrets about James?" "No." Catherine was surprised by how true that was. "Our marriage died long before today. I just finally stopped pretending otherwise." "And about coming back to the cabin?" Kit asked, his voice carefully neutral. Catherine considered the question. "Should I have?" "Is it putting you in an impossible position?" "No," Kit said after a moment. "Truth is, I'd be worried about you in Bodie. Town like that, it's no place for a woman alone." "And your cabin is?" Catherine asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. She felt rather than saw Kit's smile. "At least at my cabin, the only man you have to worry about is me." "I'm not worried about you," Catherine said honestly. They rode in silence for a while longer, the only sounds the creaking of the saddle and Jasper's steady breathing as he navigated the snowy trail. I should tell you, Kit said eventually. I won't expect anything from you in return for staying, I mean. Catherine felt heat rise to her cheeks as she understood his meaning. I never thought you would. Good, Kit said, sounding relieved. I just wanted to be clear. You'll be safe with me, Catherine. You have my word on that. I know, she replied simply, and she did. In the short time she had known him, Kit had proven himself to be a man of honor, something her husband, for all his surface charm, had never been. They reached the cabin as the sun was beginning to set, the small structure looking more welcoming to Catherine than any grand house ever had. Kit helped her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist, lingering perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. Home, sweet home, he said with a small smile, gesturing toward the cabin. Home. The word settled in Catherine's chest with unexpected warmth. It had been so long since anywhere had felt like home. The small farm where she had grown up was long gone, sold to pay her parents' medical debts after their deaths. The series of increasingly shabby rented rooms she had shared with James had never felt like more than temporary shelter. But this simple cabin, with its sturdy walls and smoking chimney, felt more like home than anywhere had in years. Yes, she agreed softly. Home. Over the following weeks, Catherine and Kit fell into a comfortable routine. Kit showed her how to set and check traps, how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to shoot his rifle in case she needed to defend herself while he was away from the cabin. Catherine, in turn, brought order and comfort to Kit's simple existence, mending his clothes, cooking more varied meals from their limited supplies, even fashioning curtains for the small windows from an old blanket she found in a trunk. They worked well together, their strengths complementing each other in ways that surprised them both. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes reading, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. It was during one such evening in late January, with snow falling softly outside and a rabbit stew simmering on the stove, that Kit finally shared more of his past with Catherine. I was married once, he said unexpectedly, his eyes fixed on the flames. Her name was Sarah. Catherine looked up from the sock she was darning, surprised by this revelation. In all their conversations, Kit had never mentioned a wife. What happened? She asked gently when he didn't continue. Kit's hands tightened around the cup he was holding. Fever took her, 10 years ago now. We were homesteading in Nebraska, had a small place, nothing fancy, but it was ours. His voice was low, the words clearly difficult to speak after so long holding them inside. Bad winter that year. Sarah fell sick just after Christmas. By New Year's, she was gone. I'm so sorry, Catherine said, her heart aching for the pain she could hear in his voice. Kit nodded, acknowledging her sympathy. Couldn't stay there after, sold the place, drifted west, took whatever work came my way, didn't much care if I lived or died for a while there. He looked up, meeting her eyes. That's why I live out here, after Sarah. Being around people, seeing families, hearing children laugh, it was like a knife twisting every time. Catherine set aside her darning and moved to sit beside him on the bench, close but not quite touching. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. I understand now why you chose solitude. Kit was quiet for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his face. The funny thing is, he said finally, I hadn't thought about Sarah in months, not until you showed up at my door. His eyes met Catherine's, something vulnerable in their blue depths. You reminded me what it was like to care about another person's well-being, to worry if they were warm enough, had enough to eat, were happy. Catherine's breath caught at the raw honesty in his words. And is that a good thing? She asked hesitantly. Terrifying, Kit admitted with a small, rueful smile. But yes, I think it is. They sat together in silence after that, watching the fire burn down to embers. Something had shifted between them, a deepening of trust, an acknowledgement of the connection that had been growing since the moment Catherine had collapsed into Kit's arms at his doorway. As January gave way to February, the days grew incrementally longer, the sunlight stronger. Kit began making preparations for the spring thaw-repairing tools, planning what supplies they would need once the trails to Bodie were passable again. Catherine found herself dreading the coming of spring, knowing it meant decisions would have to be made about her future. She had grown to love the rhythms of life, with Kit the early mornings checking traps, the satisfaction of a meal prepared from ingredients they had hunted or preserved themselves, the peaceful evenings by the fire. More than that, she had grown to love Kit himself. The realization came to her gradually, not as a sudden epiphany, but as a slow dawning of certainty. She loved his quiet strength, his unwavering honesty, the way his rare smiles transformed his serious face. She loved how he listened when she spoke, how he respected her opinions, how he never made her feel less for not knowing something but instead took pleasure in teaching her. But did he feel the same? Catherine wasn't sure. Kit was unfailingly kind and considerate, but he was also reserved, careful to maintain certain boundaries between them despite their close quarters. He never touched her except when necessary, helping her across a fallen log, steadying her as she learned to shoot his rifle, and always with a careful propriety that both frustrated and endeared her. In early March, a week of unusually warm weather caused rapid snowmelt in the mountains. Kit came in from checking his claim one afternoon with concern etched on his face. "River's rising fast," he reported, hanging his coat by the door. "If this warm spell holds, we might see flooding in the lower meadows." Catherine looked up from the stew she was stirring. "Is there anything we should do to prepare?" Kit smiled at her use of "we," a small thing that seemed to please him. "Move the traps to higher ground, make sure our supplies are secure." He hesitated. "If the river gets too high, we might have to leave for a few days." "Head up to the line shack on the ridge." "Is that likely?" Catherine asked, trying to keep the alarm from her voice. The thought of leaving the safety of their cabin was unsettling. "Hard to say," Kit replied honestly. "Spring floods are unpredictable, better to be prepared." The next morning, they awoke to the sound of rushing water much closer than it should have been. Kit was out of his bedroll in an instant, pulling on his boots and rushing to the door. Catherine followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. The sight that greeted them was alarming. The small stream that ran about 50 yards from the cabin had swollen overnight, its banks overflowing. Water was already creeping across the clearing toward the cabin. "Get dressed," Kit said urgently. "Pack whatever you can carry: food, warm clothes, the medicine kit. I'll saddle Jasper and get the rifle." Catherine moved quickly, her heart pounding as she gathered their essentials. Outside, she could hear the water growing louder, a rushing, hungry sound that sent fear prickling down her spine. By the time she had filled 2 saddlebags with supplies, the water had reached the edge of the cabin. Kit appeared in the doorway, his expression grim. "We need to go now," he said. "The trail to the ridge will be underwater soon." Catherine nodded, pulling on the coat he had given her months ago and grabbing the saddlebags. Outside, Jasper was already saddled, shifting nervously as the water lapped at his hooves. Kit helped Catherine mount, then swung up behind her. As they rode away from the cabin, Catherine looked back, a lump forming in her throat at the sight of their home threatened by the rising waters. "Will it be all right?" she asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "Cabin's built solid," Kit reassured her. "Might get some water damage to the floor, but the walls should hold. We'll come back once the water recedes." The trail to the ridge was already treacherous, streams of runoff cutting across it in multiple places. Jasper picked his way carefully, guided by Kit's steady hands. By the time they reached the line shack, a crude, one-room structure Kit had built as a shelter when working his higher claims, the sun was fully up, revealing the extent of the flooding in the valley below. "My God," Catherine breathed, dismounting to stand at the edge of the ridge. From their elevated position, she could see that much of the valley was underwater, a lake where yesterday there had been meadows. Their cabin was visible in the distance, the water now halfway up its walls. Kit came to stand beside her, his face somber. "Worst flooding I've seen in these parts," he admitted. "But the water will go down. Might take a few days, but it will go down." Catherine nodded, taking comfort from his certainty. "And in the meantime," Kit gestured toward the line shack, "it's not much, but it'll keep us dry." The line shack was indeed primitive, just 4 walls, a roof, and a small iron stove. There was no bed, just a rough, wooden platform where Kit sometimes slept when working late at his claim. But it was solid and, most importantly, high above the floodwaters. They spent the day making the shack as comfortable as possible. Kit hunted and brought back a rabbit, which Catherine skinned and prepared with practiced ease. As darkness fell, they sat close to the small stove, the limited space of the shack forcing a proximity they had carefully avoided in the larger cabin. "I've been thinking," Kit said after they had eaten, his voice low in the dimly lit space, "about what happens when spring comes fully." Catherine's heart skipped a beat. Here it was the conversation she had been both anticipating and dreading. "Oh," she managed, trying to sound casual. Kit shifted, his shoulder brushing against hers. "You said you'd stay until you figured out your next steps. I was wondering if you had." Catherine stared into the small flame visible through the grate of the stove. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "I could go to Sacramento, perhaps, try to find work as a seamstress or a cook." Kit was quiet for a long moment. "Or you could stay," he said finally, so softly she almost didn't hear him over the crackle of the fire and the distant rush of floodwaters. Catherine turned to look at him, finding his blue eyes serious and intent on her face. "Stay," she repeated, her heart suddenly pounding. Kit nodded, reaching slowly to take her hand in his rough one. "With me, not as a guest or as someone passing through," he paused, seeming to gather his courage. "As my wife, if you'd consider it." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "Kit." "I know it hasn't been that long," he continued quickly. "And maybe it's too soon after everything with James. I don't expect an answer right away, but I want you to know that I've grown to care for you, Catherine, more than I thought possible." Tears pricked at Catherine's eyes. "I've grown to care for you too," she whispered. "I can't offer you much," Kit said, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. "Life up here is hard, and I'm not a wealthy man, but I promise to treat you with respect and kindness for as long as we both live." Catherine felt a smile spreading across her face even as tears spilled over. "Those are the only riches I need," she said softly. Kit's eyes searched hers. "Is that a yes?" Instead of answering with words, Catherine leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to his. Kit froze for a moment in surprise, then responded, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with exquisite tenderness. When they finally broke apart, Kit rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for months," he admitted, a smile in his voice. "What took you so long?" Catherine teased, her heart so full she thought it might burst. Kit chuckled. "Wanted to be sure you felt the same, didn't want to presume." "Always the gentleman," Catherine murmured, leaning in to kiss him again. That night they slept side by side on the narrow platform, Catherine's head resting on Kit's shoulder, his arm wrapped securely around her. Outside, the floodwaters continued to rise, but inside the small shack, they were warm, safe, and no longer alone. The floodwaters receded slowly over the next week, revealing a landscape transformed by the force of nature. When they finally returned to the cabin, they found the damage less severe than they had feared. The floor was warped in places, and anything they had left at ground level was ruined, but the structure itself was sound. "Nothing that can't be fixed," Kit declared after inspecting every corner. "We'll have it back to rights in no time." Catherine smiled at his optimism, already planning how they would make the cabin theirs, not his, not hers, but a shared home where they would build their life together. They were married 2 weeks later in Bodie by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through. It was a simple ceremony, with only Mrs. Fleming from the hotel and the local blacksmith as witnesses. Catherine wore her best dress, freshly washed and mended with wildflowers in her hair. Kit wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard for the occasion. As they exchanged vows, Catherine thought back to that terrible night in the blizzard, when she had been certain she would die alone and abandoned. How strange and wonderful that the darkest moment of her life had led her to this, to Kit, to love, to a future brighter than any she had imagined. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher said, and Kit did, his hands gentle on her waist, his kiss a promise of all the days to come. That evening, as they rode back to their cabin through a landscape now lush with early spring growth, Catherine looked over at her new husband, at the strong profile she had come to know so well. at the blue eyes that regarded her with such tenderness. "Happy?" Kit asked, catching her gaze. "More than I ever thought possible," Catherine replied honestly. Kit's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Me too," he said simply. And as they approached the cabin that was now truly their home, Catherine remembered the words Kit had spoken to her that first night, when she was half frozen and terrified. "You're not alone anymore." He had been right, and she never would be again. 2 years later, Catherine stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching as Kit showed their son Thomas how to whittle a small piece of wood. At 18 months, the boy was too young to actually carve anything, but he watched his father's hands with rapt attention, his blue eyes so like Kit's wide with wonder. "Like this, Tommy," Kit was saying, guiding the boy's small hand in a safe motion across the wood. "Slow and steady." Catherine smiled at the scene, her hand resting on her rounded belly where their second child grew. The past 2 years had been the happiest of her life. Together, she and Kit had built a home and a future neither had thought possible after their respective losses. The cabin was larger now, with a proper second room added the previous summer. Kit's mining claim had produced well enough to provide them with comfortable security, if not wealth. They had a small garden, a few chickens, and plans to add a cow next year. But the true riches of their life together couldn't be measured in gold or property. They were found in moments like this: Kit's patient teaching, Thomas's delighted laugh, the quiet contentment that filled their home. "Careful there," Catherine called as Thomas reached for the knife. "Remember what Papa said about sharp things." "He's fine," Kit assured her with a smile. "Aren't you, son, going to be a fine woodcarver one day?" Thomas beamed at his father's praise, his chubby cheeks dimpling. "Like Papa," he declared proudly. "Just like Papa," Catherine agreed, coming to join them by the fire. She lowered herself carefully onto the bench Kit had carved for her during her first pregnancy, a beautiful piece with wildflowers inlaid along the back. Kit looked up at her, his eyes soft with the love that still made her heart skip a beat even after 2 years of marriage. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his gaze dropping to her belly. "Restless," Catherine admitted. "This one's more active than Thomas was." "Another boy, then," Kit predicted with a grin, "or a very spirited girl." "Either way, they'll be loved," Catherine said softly. Kit reached out to take her hand, squeezing it gently. "More than they could ever know." Later that night, after Thomas was asleep in his small bed, Catherine and Kit sat before the fire as they had done countless nights before. Kit was finishing a cradle for the new baby, his hands moving with practiced skill over the wood. Catherine was quilting, piecing together scraps of fabric to make a blanket. "I had a letter from Sarah Fleming today," Catherine said, referring to the former hotel owner who had become a friend. "She says James was seen in San Francisco last month." Kit's hands paused briefly on the cradle. "Did that bother you?" he asked, his voice careful. Catherine considered the question honestly. "No," she said after a moment. "It feels like that happened to someone else in another lifetime." She set her quilting aside and moved to kneel beside Kit's chair, taking his rough hands in hers. "This is my life now. You, Thomas, our home, this new baby. I wouldn't change any of it." Kit leaned down to kiss her, his lips warm and familiar against hers. "Nor would I," he murmured against her mouth. As they prepared for bed, Catherine thought about the twists of fate that had brought her here. If James hadn't abandoned her in that blizzard, if Kit hadn't found her half frozen at his door, if she hadn't found the courage to leave her marriage behind, none of this would exist. "What are you thinking about?" Kit asked as he climbed into bed beside her, his arm automatically going around her shoulders to draw her close. "How sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best," she replied, settling against his chest. "If I hadn't nearly died in that blizzard, I never would have found you." Kit was quiet for a moment, his hand gentle on her hair. "I think about that too," he admitted. "How close we came to never meeting. It makes every day we have together that much more precious." Catherine lifted her head to look at him in the dim light. "I love you, Kieran Tanner," she said softly, using his full name as she rarely did. "More than I have words to express." Kit's eyes were tender as he traced her cheek with his fingertips. And I love you, Catherine Tanner. More than I ever thought possible. As Catherine drifted off to sleep in the safety of her husband's arms, she remembered once more the words that had changed the course of her life. You're not alone anymore. In the darkest moment of her life, those simple words had been a lifeline, a promise of something better to come. And Kit had kept that promise every day since. Together, they had built a life filled with love, hard work, and joy, a life Catherine had once thought forever beyond her reach. The storm that had nearly killed her had instead led her home, to the place and the person she was always meant to find. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, gentle and nourishing on the land around their cabin. But inside, all was warm and secure. Catherine and Kit slept peacefully in each other's arms, their son dreaming in the next room, their unborn child growing steadily beneath Catherine's heart, a family forged in the most unexpected of circumstances, but stronger for the storms they had weathered together. 3 years later, Catherine sat on the porch of their cabin, now a proper small house with 3 rooms and a covered porch, watching as Kit taught 5-year-old Thomas and 3-year-old Eliza how to fish in the stream. Baby William, just 8 months old, slept peacefully in a basket beside her, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. Careful now, Tommy, Kit called as their eldest cast his line with more enthusiasm than skill. You'll scare all the fish away. Sorry, Papa, Thomas replied, his face scrunched in concentration as he tried again, more gently this time. Eliza, not to be outdone by her older brother, mimicked his movements with her smaller fishing rod, her dark curls so like Catherine's bouncing with each motion. Like this, Papa. She called. Perfect, sweetheart, Kit praised, and Catherine smiled at the pride in his voice. Their life had expanded in ways Catherine could never have predicted when she first sought shelter at Kit's door during that fateful blizzard. Kit's claim had produced enough gold to allow them to improve their home and acquire more land. They now had a small herd of cattle, a vegetable garden that produced enough to trade with neighbors, and a reputation in the scattered community as hardworking, decent folk always ready to lend a hand to those in need. The isolation that had once defined Kit's existence had given way to a measured engagement with the world. They traveled to Bodie now, a more established town though still rough around the edges, every few weeks for supplies and socializing. They hosted occasional gatherings at their home, particularly during the holidays when travel was difficult for the older residents of the area. Catherine had started a small school in their front room during the winter months, teaching not only their own children but those of 3 neighboring families. Her skill with a needle had also become known, and she occasionally took in sewing work not because they needed the money, but because she enjoyed the creative outlet and the connection to others it provided. Kit, once so solitary, had found a balance between his natural preference for quiet and his role as husband, father, and neighbor. He still spent long days working his claim or hunting in the mountains, but he always returned home with stories for the children and a warm smile for Catherine. Mama. Mama, I caught one. Thomas's excited shout pulled Catherine from her reflections. Her son was struggling with his fishing rod as Kit moved to help him land what appeared to be a decent-sized trout. Well done, Catherine called, carefully standing so as not to wake William. That will make a fine dinner. Eliza, determined not to be left out, redoubled her efforts, her small face set with determination that made Catherine hide a smile. Their daughter had inherited both Catherine's stubbornness and Kit's quiet persistence, a combination that both amused and occasionally exasperated her parents. You too, Lisa, Kit encouraged, one hand steadying Thomas's catch while the other helped adjust Eliza's grip. Just be patient. Catherine carried William down to the stream bank, the baby still sleeping soundly despite being moved. She settled on a flat rock, watching her family with a heart so full it almost hurt. He's still out? Kit asked, glancing at the baby as he helped Thomas remove the hook from the trout's mouth. Like a rock, Catherine confirmed. Unlike his brother and sister at this age, Kit grinned. 3rd time's the charm, they say. I got one too, Eliza suddenly squealed, her small rod bending dramatically. "Papa, help." Kit moved quickly to assist her, his large hands gentle over her tiny ones as they worked together to land what turned out to be a small but respectable fish. Eliza's face glowed with pride as Kit praised her success. "Mama, look, I did it just like Tommy," she declared, holding up her catch for Catherine's approval. "I see that, darling. What a wonderful fisherman you are," Catherine replied warmly. "Both of you will feed us well tonight." As the afternoon progressed, William woke and Kit took a turn holding him while Catherine helped the older children clean their catch. The baby's eyes, brown like Catherine's, unlike his blue-eyed siblings, tracked his father's movements with clear adoration. "He's growing so fast," Kit remarked, bouncing the baby gently in his arms. "Seems like yesterday we were bringing him home." Catherine nodded, remembering the snowy February night when William had come into the world. Unlike her first two relatively easy births, William's arrival had been difficult and prolonged. Kit had ridden through a snowstorm to fetch the midwife from 10 miles away, returning just in time for the birth. "I still remember your face when you came back with Mrs. Porter," Catherine said softly. "I've never seen you so frightened." Kit's expression grew serious. "I was," he admitted, shifting William to his shoulder. "The thought of losing you—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Catherine reached out to squeeze his arm, understanding the fear he couldn't articulate. "But you didn't. We're all here, safe and together." Kit covered her hand with his free one, his eyes full of emotion, and that's all that matters. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, and the house was quiet except for the crackling of the fire, Kit and Catherine sat together on their porch, watching as the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky. Kit had his arm around Catherine's shoulders, her head resting comfortably against him. "I was thinking," Kit said after a comfortable silence, "about expanding the house again next summer. Add another room at the back. The children are growing and they'll need more space soon." Catherine nodded, having had similar thoughts. "Thomas will want his own room before long," she agreed, "and the school is getting crowded when all the neighbor children come." "We could build a proper schoolhouse," Kit suggested, "on that flat piece of land by the big pine. Make it large enough for the community gatherings too." Catherine looked up at him, surprised and pleased by the suggestion. "You do that?" Kit smiled down at her. "Why not? You're a good teacher, Catherine. Those children are lucky to have you." He paused. "And I'm proud of what you've built here, not just our home, but the way you've brought people together." Warmth spread through Catherine's chest at his words. "We've built it together," she corrected gently. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Kit's arm tightened around her. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" he asked. "If your husband hadn't left you in that storm," Catherine considered the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I look at our children, at our home, at you, and I can't imagine any other life than this one." "Nor can I," Kit said softly. "Though there are days I'm still amazed you chose to stay with a rough mountain man like me." Catherine shifted to look directly into his eyes. "Best choice I ever made," she said firmly, "and one I'd make again every day for the rest of my life." Kit's smile was tender as he leaned down to kiss her, his lips familiar and yet still capable of sending a thrill through her after 5 years of marriage. "I love you, Catherine Tanner," he murmured against her mouth. "And I love you, Kieran Tanner," she replied, "forever and always." As they sat together under the vast expanse of stars, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the desperate night when she thought her life was ending, to this moment of profound contentment, it had been a path neither of them could have foreseen, but one they had walked together, step by step, day by day. The abandoned wife, the solitary prospector, two lonely souls who had found in each other not just companionship, but a love that had healed old wounds and created new life. Their story had begun in a blizzard, with words that had seemed impossible to believe at the time. "You're not alone anymore." But Kit had made that promise true, not just for that night, but for all the nights and days that followed. And Catherine had done the same for him, bringing light and warmth back into a life that had grown cold and empty. Together, they had built something rare and precious, A family, a home, a love that would endure through whatever storms life might still bring their way. And as the stars continued their ancient dance overhead, Catherine and Kit Tanner held each other close, grateful for the blizzard that had brought them together, and for every moment since that had proven what they had both come to know with absolute certainty: they would never be alone again.